Well, greetings. My name is James Stoner. I'm director of the Eric Voegelin Institute at Louisiana State University, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to the first of a five-part series of talks on the theme, Who was Eric Voegelin and what did he think? Each week, for the next so many weeks, I'll interview a leading scholar who's written about or taught Voegelin's works on a topic guided by the outline of the Eric Voegelin Reader, edited by Charles Embry and Glenn Hughes, and published in 2017 by the University of Missouri Press. The essays in the Reader were culled from the 34 volumes of the collected works of Eric Voegelin, also published by Missouri under the general editorship of my retired colleague and the founding director of the Institute, Ellis Sandos. Voegelin taught here at LSU for a little over 15 years, from 1942 to 58, being named one of the inaugural recipients of the university's most prestigious honor, the Boyd Professorship. He had fled to the United States after being forced to leave his teaching position in Austria when the Nazis annexed the country in 1938. But he returned to the University of Munich in 1958 as a US citizen and taught for a decade on its faculty. After retiring in 1968, he came back to the US and settled at the Hoover Institution in California, where he served until his death in 1985. Today, we're very honored to have as our guest speaker, Dr. Barry Cooper, professor of political science at the University of Calgary, author, editor, or translator of 35 books, including several volumes that he edited for the collected works. He's written extensively about Voegelin, including a book about Voegelin's early scholarship, and another gathering the recollections of Voegelin's friends and students. And then this book from 1999, Eric Voegelin and the Foundations of Modern Political Science. Dr. Cooper's topic today is an intellectual biography of Eric Voegelin. Our format will be as follows. He and I will have a conversation to introduce the topic for about a half hour or 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions using, if you would, the raise hand function on Zoom, which is under the reactions button. And I'll recognize the questioners and ask you then and only then to unmute yourself for your question. Well, let's get started. Dr. Cooper, welcome to the Voegelin Institute. And if you could, tell us about the education of Eric Voegelin, by which I mean not only his formal education, but how he came to understand the world in his distinctive way.
Well, first of all, Professor Stoner, thank you very much for the invitation. I've been to LSU a couple of times at the invitation of Ellis Sandos, and it's always great to be back there, even if it's just virtually. Yes, the education of Eric Voegelin. I've thought over the past 3 or 4 days about what that exactly would mean. Some of it, of course, is his formal education. Which I think is probably less important. But he was a high school student in what the Austrians called a Realgymnasium, which is not quite the same as the German kind of classical gymnasium, in that the emphasis was more on modern languages rather than Latin and Greek, although he did know Latin as a high school student. He then went to the University of Vienna and got his degree in basically in what we would call jurisprudence, I think. And he said he did this because he could get his doctorate in, I think, 3 years rather than the normal 4 or 5 years, so that he could support himself. But what is interesting in his sort of educational trajectory is that he had 2 thesis supervisors, which was unusual in itself. Hans Kelsen, who was probably the most important jurisprudential thinker in the German-speaking world at the time. He was the author of the Austrian, post-war Austrian Constitution. But he was also supervised by a man less well known named Othmar Spahn, who was a sociologist in the who was seen, I think, somewhat exaggeratedly, as the successor to Max Weber. So he had these 2 influences right from the start, and his education in the proper sense of the term, I think, reflected these two aspects of his initial supervision as a doctoral student. Among other things, he never learned Greek until he returned from the United States in the late 1920s, which was, considering the amount of work he did on the Greek philosophers, that will probably be kind of surprising. So let me just say, as a kind of introduction to this very large topic, Voegelin pretty much, I would say, pursued his own education. And as he said in one of the passages that is in the reader, people ask me what are the motivations for my work is, and I tell them it's the political situation. That's something of a simplification, I think. It's not sort of ordinary politics in the way that we think of it, but it's also what you might call intellectual politics. And there, I think he certainly charted his own course.
And he would have been in school during World War I. Is that right? He was just a little too young to have to serve in the war?
That's right. I know that some of his contemporaries who were educated in Germany were drafted. I don't know what the age of being draft eligible in Austria was. It may have been different.
But he was born in 01, so when the war ends, he's only 17. And
Yeah.
I take it he's doing the doctorate in the very early 20s. Is that right? And
yes, yes, I think he got his doctorate in, I think, 1922 or 23. He was, yeah, it's pretty young. The young Dr. Voegelin, you could call him.
And then he does something surprising, right? He doesn't do what everyone else was doing in the German-speaking world, which was find where Heidegger was and go sit in on his seminars, right? Instead, he goes to America. How does he get that idea? How does he get the money to do it? He wasn't from a wealthy background, as you suggested, right? So what's behind that choice of going to America? In the excerpt we read in his autobiographical reflections, he presents that as really crucial to his own development.
I think he does not exaggerate a bit there. I have tried to find out how he actually got the support from the Rockefeller Foundation. It was the Laura Spelman Rockefeller kind of traveling fellowship that allowed young German scholars to go to the United States and also to France and the UK. I suspect, but I don't know, I haven't found the evidence. Perhaps some of his German students would know this. I suspect it was through Kelson's assistance. But yeah, he essentially spent almost 3 years in the US at some of the very important universities, Columbia, Yale, and Harvard. And then he went to Madison, to the University of Wisconsin for the better part of a year. And he met there some individuals who he said really changed his life around. I think that was also true with the Eastern universities, but he met individuals who were basically a generation away from the frontier experience of the United States. And I think that made a big difference. He saw a historical world that basically had nothing to do with Europe. And he also discovered an intellectual and what you might call a spiritual world that was completely independent of all of the sort of neo-Kantian methodological questions that were so exercising everybody in Germany in the early 1920s. So then when he gets back to Germany, he says he'd been inoculated against Heidegger because of all of this exposure to common sense philosophy and particularly a lot of the Supreme Court decisions. He found that very interesting as well. I guess he would as essentially as a law student, because the logic of Anglo-Saxon basically common law judicial decisions is quite different than what you would find in, say, Kelson's pure theory of law. So it really opened his mind to a whole new way of looking at reality.
And then he wrote a book about America. Was that his first book, or?
Yeah. It's called On on the form of the American mind. And Jürgen Gebhardt and I edited it, and so we had to kind of mess around with the translation because it was written in this very opaque kind of Weberian German that when you sort of read it, I suppose, I mean, my German's okay. It's not obviously, I'm not a native speaker. It might have made sense that if you were a German scholar about 1928, but to figure out how to translate that kind of German into something that would make sense to English speakers in this case, it was the late 20th century. It was not very easy to do. You got the message that Voegelin got very excited about what he found in the intellectual life of the United States. But apart from that, it's kind of unlike most of the early 20th century German reflections on life in America. I mean, this seemed to be a place where particularly scholars of comparative politics and comparative religion would go to find out, like, what's going on in the United States. Where do these people come from? They defeated us, the Germans, in war. We got to find out about these guys. And Voegelin's reflections on this, so far as I can see, I mean, I haven't made a inventory of everything that Germans wrote in the 20s and 30s, but what I have read, his reflections on what he called the form of the American Geist, the American mind, sure, but the American spirit as well, was really quite unusual, really quite unusual.
Did the book get much notice in Germany, or was it an academic book that was sort of put on a shelf and only rediscovered by Barry Cooper when the collected works were put together?
It was, well, let me say this, it was published by a very first-rate German publisher, Moore, in Tübingen. And it was received, I would say, by scholars. I can't recall, I probably should have looked this up. I can't recall whether it got much popular reception or not. Some of his later books did, but I honestly, I don't remember.
So where does he go from there? He spends a year in Paris, right, on his way back or something, and that doesn't seem to be as transformative as his year in America, I guess, or his 2 years in America. And then he ends up back in Austria, right?
Yes. Yeah, the time in Paris, I think was, I mean, he links it to his study of Baudin. And at one point he says he was there, I think, just for most of the summer, and he was at working at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and he said that he had the copy of every book on 16th century French thought in his hands at least once. So it was important in that it introduced him not just to Baudin, but also to what he later called the importance of Asian or Asiatic, I think is the term he used, events on Western political thinking, most notably with Machiavelli, but also with Baudin as well. So it was important. It's just it wasn't earth changing the way his time in America was.
So when he gets back to Austria, I mean, I can see how a student at Kelsen's would be interested in Baudin, right? I mean, if the latter is the origin of the theory of sovereignty, and Kelsen is the 20th century representative of that tradition. But then Voegelin doesn't do much with that, right? He takes a different tack when he publishes his next couple books in Austria.
Yeah, Baudin was not just the sovereignty, it's not just the legal thought. In the History of Political Ideas, he says Baudin was one of the few mystic thinkers of importance in Western political philosophy. And that's almost entirely overlooked. I mean, if you read Sabine, he's almost the only person who mentions Baudin. He says nothing about this. So Voegelin found an element in Baudin's thought that he thought was overlooked, to put it mildly, and was central. So that I think he incorporated that in his own work later on.
And that picks up on something you said before about his going to Wisconsin. I mean, that from the beginning, he took this interest in religion and how it fit into society and related to society. I wonder if you could say a little more about that, especially because, I know at Columbia, he studied with John Dewey. And I don't think of Dewey as a social analyst who pays too much attention to religion and how important that is for understanding society. Voegelin seems to have gone in a very different direction. Is that fair? And how does that, do you see the seeds there of some of his later work?
Yeah, the person that he studied with at Wisconsin mainly was John R. Commons, who I think is probably best known in American intellectual history as a kind of labor historian. But there was another, I think his name was Perlman, that he also studied with in Madison. And they introduced him to the kind of non-Marxist labor history that characterized, say, Gompers, and it had nothing to do with the European understanding of what the proletariat is supposed to do in the Marxist scheme of things. So it also opened a whole new way of looking at what you might call working class thought and working class history. That I think was probably pretty important as well. And again, most people don't really think very much about the papers that he wrote in the late 1920s, dealing like with the Federal Reserve Bank. He wrote a paper on the Federal Reserve Bank. Like, who cares about that? I mean, most political theorists, they vaguely know what the Federal Reserve Bank does. Well, he wrote and he translated one of Commons's papers into German on this. So he had this other dimension of what we would probably call now social history that I would say is almost universally ignored by Voegelin scholars.
How interesting. So he begins in America as something of a looking at labor economics then, because nothing seems further from the later Voegelin and what he's known for than labor economics to me. I'd forgotten that connection. How interesting. Now, he wrote a couple books on race, right? Yeah. When he was back in Germany. Is that maybe a few years later in the early 30s? How do you see those coming out of his earlier work, or is he just a young scholar who's looking for what's the topic that's animating public discussion? And obviously in the German-speaking world in the early 30s, that's it.
Yeah, well, I'd say there's kind of two parts, two ways of answering your question. The one is in his own internal development. He had this, I would say, vision of what he would call I would call a kind of comprehensive theory of law. I mean, he had this very long German word that expanded Kelsen's pure theory of law to include the importance of power, which we have now in the collected works as the theory of governance. But he also had an element of what he called at the time political ideas. And he says about 1930 that he really didn't know anything about political ideas. So he started to do the research on it. And the most important political ideas that at the time were these race ideas. And so that, I think, was one element, let's say the personal element in the genesis of the two race books. The other thing, to go back to that first quote about the political situation, which I think is what you're alluding to. Race everybody was talking about it. So he had to go through, and if you read the race books, my goodness, there's discussions of biology that most people, 17th century biologists that you've probably never heard of, that Voegelin thought were were central in the articulation of these quote ideas about race. So yeah, I think it was a combination of his own internal development with Staatslehre and the topicality of race thinking.
Is there anything about America in those books on race? I don't know them. So, I mean, I know of them, but I haven't read them. So,
no, not really.
so
No.
he treats it as a European idea and works from Gobineau and the others in the 19th century.
Yeah. There's not even very much discussion about race in America in the America book. It doesn't seem to have caught his attention, the effects and the consequences of slavery in the United States. But my recollection is there's very little in the race books about race in America.
Now, in the 1920s and 30s, when he's developing this idea of the history of political ideas, is that something that's widely taught? Do you know? Or, I mean, we now have this whole canon of sort of history of political thought, and there are Baudin isn't always in it. Sometimes he is, but we have a whole list of thinkers, and we assume it's part of education to have gone through these great texts of political ideas. And yet he hadn't, had he? I mean, had he read Plato and Aristotle and others before as part of his regular education, or is that something new that he discovers as he undertakes this project?
Yeah, certainly with the Greeks, that one of the things he says that he discovered in America is that you can't really teach, say, Plato and Aristotle if you can't read them. So like, hello. So that's when he realized he had to learn he had to have the linguistic equipment to be able to read the text about which he was going to speak, and that I think came upon him probably after he returned in the late 20s, because he says that he had this friend of his who was a member of the Stefan Georg circle, who he says taught him the intricacies of Greek grammar or something like that. But that would have been about 28 or 29. So it was, fairly late. He says that he used Max Scheler as the kind of source of what he called a philosophically adequate anthropology, by which he could then put these race ideas into the context that they properly belong. But to answer the question about history of political ideas, no, that he says at one point he said that Dunning was the only author. He had that 2-volume history of political ideas, or history of European political ideas, or something like that. This was before Sabine even published the first edition of his book. So the idea of history of political ideas, which, as everyone probably knows, he later repudiated. The notion of ideas he repudiated, but it wasn't very common. It certainly wasn't common in the German-speaking context at all.
Well, I certainly want to come back to that question of ideas and the repudiation of ideas, but maybe we could say a word about the race books get him in trouble, right, in 1938. In other words, they've come to the attention of the Nazis, and he has, about a day or so to get out of Austria when the Anschluss takes place. Is that right? And
yeah, there are some very, looking back, we've probably called them amusing reviews of the race books by members of the National Socialist intelligentsia in Germany. But he was certainly on the Gestapo was certainly aware of who he was, and they realized that he was not one of their friends. But his escape from Vienna, it was not the same day as the Anschluss. It was I think it was about 3 months later. It took the occupying authorities that long really to kind of hone in on Voegelin. And his escape, of course, was quite dramatic. I think there's several versions of how he actually got out, but it was quite a dramatic escape to Switzerland.
And then to the United States, right? He gets a letter from Arthur Holcomb or something like that at Harvard, inviting him to come teach, and that becomes the device that he needs to get through American immigration to actually get to the U.S. Is that right?
That's correct. In one of the chapters in the reader that you assigned, there's a story about this, what he calls the nice Harvard boy, who's in the embassy in Switzerland, who can't figure out why this guy wants to go to the United States because he's not Jewish. He hasn't offended anybody. So this nice Harvard boy thinks he must be a criminal. So he delays the visa until he gets this letter from Holcomb that says he's legit. You can issue him essentially it was a transit visa through France. That then they got on the boat to America.
He said he was surprised that Austria fell to the Nazis as quickly as it did.
Yeah. I've often wondered about that. His wife Lissy's family had connections. Some of her in-laws, or I can't remember if it's her brother or not, but they were members of the Austrian Nazi Party. And certainly when he got to the United States, he basically dismissed the notion, particularly popular after the war, that Austria was the first victim of the Nazis. He says, the Austrians were pretty enthusiastic about the Anschluss. And so to call them victims, I think, is let's say misleading. More than misleading, it was just, in his view, I think he said it would be nonsense.
Had he been involved in politics at all back in Austria, or was he a member of a political party, or do we know anything about that, or was he pretty much an apolitical scholar writing about politics?
Well, regarding policy, I think he was if anything, he says he was more like a social democrat than anything else. So, but he wasn't a Marxist. And he does tell a story, I don't know if it's in the autobiographical reflections or someplace else, of he was lecturing for fees as a privatdocent at the University of Vienna. And some of his students were very hardcore Marxists. And they came up to him after one of his lectures and said it would really be ashamed that they'd have to kill him after they took power. and he found this, he said, well, it's nice of you to let me know. But his, to the extent that he had any political commitments, they were probably what you might call center left, I'd say. But again, there's very little evidence one way or another. In the book on Austria, his position is I would say very analytical, very scholarly. He certainly went a long way to criticize a lot of what had been written about Austria. So that, you can, I suppose, if you were reading it in terms of policy differences, I mean, I never have, since I don't know enough about who his interlocutors might have been. But he does make these provocative statements about what happened in post-war Austria, that it was not he said the Austrians are not a political people. They're not a body politic. And so that they can't possibly constitute themselves as a republic in any kind of normal sense of the term. And it remains to be seen what will come out of this, of Austria. In this case, nothing came out of Austria until after the war. There's certainly, I would say, from my experience of being in Austria, they certainly are distinct from the Germans. Now, I'm not so sure that they were in the 1930s. That's just get from reading what Voegelin says.
Now, when he lands in the US and eventually settles at LSU, he conceives this project of a history of political ideas, right? And then he has second thoughts about it. How did that, and I think it's that, as I understand this sort of intellectual biography, that becomes the key moment that sort of makes Voegelin who he is. And that moment when he comes to a kind of political maturity. Is that correct? And what's at issue there? Why is it that he gives up on this history of ideas until you and Sandoz and the others decide, oh, we're going to publish it anyway? I mean, when I first came to LSU, they were still in a file cabinet. They had all these volumes, and people would now and again go, they had to write a paper on Spinoza. I remember somebody had to write a paper on Spinoza, and then he cited it. But I mean, there it was. And eventually it comes out, but Voegelin himself didn't publish it. He abandoned the whole project. What's the story there? Why does he do that? And what's he replace it with?
Well, yeah. Let me just say, to go back to the point about when it was in manuscript. The first time I came across this was actually in Munich, and I was there doing some other work, and I met Peter Opitz, and he said, you must come and look at this. And there were about, I don't know, huge file folders, or what we used to call duotang binders, with all of the history of political ideas, and I'd never heard of it. And Opitz said, well, we use this all the time for lectures in the history of political philosophy. So it was, and then the first time I read it, I thought, my goodness, this is unlike anything that Sabine was. He was the guy that you went to for the history of political thought. And then the Strauss-Cropsey reader came out. It was completely unlike that as well. So I got very interested in it. And I managed to get photocopies from Opitz, and then I used it for my lectures in the history of political thought as well. What happened? Well, there's Voegelin's version of what happened, and it is that he came to see that the notion of an idea was something that he says was invented by the Enlightenment scholars, and that he then he uses this polemical language. It was an Enlightenment conceit. That's, I think, in retrospect, that's probably true, but that's looking back from a position that he developed much later. If you look at the actual texts where he stops and rethinks things, it was I would say about 1947 or so, and he was trying to push what is essentially Sabine's argument about the importance of political history in conditioning the responses of political philosophers. It's not quite historicism in the way that Strauss criticizes historicism, but it's that there's a connection between political history and political thought. And Voegelin came to specifically Schelling, but he came to this understanding that there was a disconnect between political thought, or between political philosophy, and what was happening in politics, which previously you could make a connection that there was, say, an institutional relationship between St. Thomas and the medieval Sacred Empire. You couldn't do that by the time you got to these very sophisticated thinkers such as Schelling, and living in the midst of what was essentially a kind of tribalized national, and eventually he called it Gnostic, but there was just a disconnect. So he said, this is the problem I have to really figure out. How can you have this disconnect between political institutions and political thinking? And that's when he reflected, I would say, I mean, this is my interpretation, not what he says, but he reflected on the correspondence he had with his friend Alfred Schutz, whom they'd been pals since in Vienna days, on the importance of consciousness in Husserl. And he and Schutz had this exchange, a very extensive exchange of letters on the significance of Husserl and Husserl's theory of consciousness. And then Voegelin, again, this is my interpretation, Voegelin developed his own philosophy of consciousness that could account for the disconnect between political institutions and political thought. And then,
is that what leads to order in history?
Yes, exactly. But before you get to order in history, there is this focus on what Voegelin called experience and symbolization that gets reflected in the language of order in history. But it was I think it was a kind of independent discovery that he then saw played out in the order in history, particularly the first 3 volumes of order in history, which are not the same. I mean, we don't have the original Plato and Aristotle from the history of political ideas. I wish we did. But even at the Hoover, the earliest version is clearly a manuscript for order in history, volume 2, actually.
And is that the work that really makes his reputation? Order in history, it's first, at least the first volumes. The first volumes come out together, and then there's this long hiatus, and before the 4th volume.
I would say what really made his reputation was the New Science of Politics, because that if neither of us have been on the cover of Time, so far as I know, and to have this rather opaque condensation of the history of political ideas featured in what at the time was probably the most important news magazine, weekly news magazine in the world, was quite an achievement. And I took a look at some of the letters that he got after the thing in Time came out, and some of them are absolutely hilarious. Some of them are what you'd expect from scholars, but ordinary people just got very excited about this. So I think that's probably what made his initial impact on American consciousness, and then the Order in History came out a couple of years later.
And just to sort of briefly summarize what that's about for people who are getting this for the first time, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Order in History, how would you describe that project? In 50 words or less. I'm kidding.
Well, as he said, the order of history emerges from the history of order. And if you know what that means, that tells you everything you need to know. The history of order is pretty much history of political ideas, but that has to be leavened, I would say, by philosophy of consciousness. You can't, there's no 15-word answer. I'm sorry. And Order in History changes as well. The first volume actually was the last one of the first 3 that was written. And it was written following a lengthy visit to Europe to discuss, as Voegelin would say, the problems with Old Testament scholars, which he did. And to start, I mean, Order in History Volume 1 starts with Egypt and Mesopotamia. Well, nobody who writes normal history of political ideas starts with those pre-Greek empires. So that in itself was new, and Voegelin did this because he had listened to a German scholar of what the Germans call Altertumswissenschaft, which basically means antiquity studies, in other words, pre-Greek stuff, named Meyer. Toynbee cites Meyer as well. And so Voegelin realized that's where you have to start. And he does this, and he sees then the change from the Israelites and from the Greek philosophers in the context of this, what he, using his philosophy of consciousness language, called the compact consciousness of these early empires. That the Israelites and the Greeks had what he would call equivalent breaks with the compactness of what Thales called the world filled with gods. That the gods were somehow beyond the world, or God was beyond the world, and humans were nevertheless burdened with trying to make some kind of understanding of that experience. That's a big change from history of political ideas.
Let's open the floor for questions. We've
Sure.
talked for about 40 minutes, so let's open up. Any questions? We've got the hand function. Just put it up, and I'll be happy to recognize you. And I guess I can keep chatting with Barry until the first question arises. But I see a couple have shut up. So first question from Trevor Shelley. Trevor, if you could unmute yourself, go ahead and ask.
Well, thank you both. Delighted to be here and appreciate the the remarks. I was just wondering, Professor Cooper, if you could elaborate on the point that you made when you were talking about the problem that Voegelin encountered, this disconnect between political institutions and political ideas. You suggested his approach was not quite historicism in the sense that Leo Strauss may have criticized it. Could you say a little bit more about that, distinguishing it from, say, the historicism that Strauss would criticize, and maybe something about that relationship? Thanks.
Okay. Well, I can try. The Voegelin agreed with Strauss with respect to historicism. And the historicist argument was that essentially the writings of any particular philosopher is essentially a reflection of the limitations of their historical context. And there's some very funny letters from Voegelin, not to Strauss, but to other people, saying how presumptuous that is, that if you are living, say, in the early 20th century, you don't have to deal with this old dead white guy, Plato, because we have so much more understanding because of our historical position. He thought that was ridiculous. I mean, and there's the agreement, I think, with Strauss. What he wanted to suggest is that the range of available language symbols at any particular time is limited, so that when Aristotle uses the language of the polis in the politics, he does so, Voegelin said, even though he knew perfectly well that the age of the polis was dead and gone, that he was, after all, the tutor of Alexander. Yet that was those were the language symbols that he had available. And the term that he later used to describe that conditioning of Aristotle's, for example, Aristotle's language, was historicity, not historicism. So that you can't really expect Aristotle to use the language, say, of St. Thomas. Might expect St. Thomas to be able to modify Aristotle, obviously. But the range of experiences that Aristotle had, just to stay with those two, did not include what we now call revelation. So you can't expect Aristotle to talk in that using those kind of symbols. That's essentially, I think, what he meant.
David Bourne. Go ahead and unmute yourself if you would, David. No, that took your picture away. Okay, we've lost you there. I'm going to let you see if you can figure out the
Unmute.
text.
Can you
there
hear
you
me
are.
now?
Now you're unmuted. Okay.
The first thing I want to say is to Dr. Cooper, we met years ago in Toronto. All the work that you've done for Voegelin has been so helpful for me as a retired high school teacher kind of thing. However, here's my question, because I've studied Voegelin for years and read most of his papers and thought about, like, historical kinds of connections you can make. And I use that word historical very, very loosely. But here's the problem. We have paradigms in terms of science where we look at reality and then we try to put people's thought together in a formative kind of way. And then we kind of miss that noetic kind of consciousness, that anamnetic sort of stuff that he develops in Anamnesis, especially book 3 in Order and History, and later in It Reality. And consequently, we end up maybe looking at thinkers like George Grant and comparing them, and then missing Christian Platonism because of language differentiation. So my question is, like, here we are looking at Voegelin, his early development, like his flee from Nazism, but we're missing a really philosophical important part of the whole development of consciousness. I was wondering if, and you did allude to it just in the end, in fairness, but maybe you can comment on that further.
Well, I would, again, just sticking with Voegelin's words on this particular question. He would say something along the lines, I think, that the danger of seeing his development as a kind of independent process is what he used to call the dogma, turning things into doctrines, and the importance, as you mentioned, of anamnesis in his sense, and in terms of his philosophy of consciousness, is that, as he said in great detail, it's always somebody's consciousness. These things don't, he would say, they don't exist without individuals who actually have the experiences, have the conscious experiences that they then use language to use his language to articulate, to make communicable. The balance is between avoiding doctrines and avoiding sort of, you might call, subjectivism, or just saying, well, these are just his his personal opinions. And I don't think there's a simple way of clarifying that, apart from using the languages that he used of various kinds of paradoxes. And the thing about paradoxes is that they are not clear. They contain a kind of contradiction that you can't really dissolve without, I would say, being unfaithful to the complexity, in this case, of Voegelin's own personal experiences, which goes back to that initial quotation from the autobiographical reflections, that the motivation for his work is his experiences of reality, but that's not subjective. It's the experiences of reality that you can clarify, and that you can, as a non-Voegelin person, you can experience in a very similar kind of way. So it's not subjective, but it's also not doctrine. And it's a very, you have to, I would say, a fairly high tolerance for ambiguity to get into Voegelin's work.
Can I make one quick last comment?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, my problem is the way we might view the historical formative development and later conscious development in terms of the metaxy, in terms of things that through wonder, like if you look at book 3, like, in his analysis of Aristotle and Plato, and wonder leading to, like different formative things through eros that are then formed by the agathon. My comment is that becomes a change from a historical pattern in terms of a more noesis, like something that disforms, derails hermeneutically from history. That was my comments.
Yeah.
Anyway, listen, I'm so thankful for everything that you guys are doing. It's amazing, the work that's being done here. And thank you so much for letting me speak.
Sure, thanks for your question. Will Combs is next. Are you there, Will? We see him floating in space.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I've seen in other sources that Schelling, especially his later philosophy of religion, like in the philosophy of mythology and revelation, was also a major influence on Voegelin. And so I was wondering whether either of you might be able to expand a bit on that.
Yeah, there is a very good book. I'm drawing a blank. It was his dissertation on Schelling and Voegelin that goes into this in great detail. It's someplace behind me here. I haven't read it for several years, but the connection. Yeah, Gary Day. That's right. Von Hiking put that up. The connection again is ambiguous. I think that Voegelin, he had in his library at Erlangen, there is a fairly extensive collection. I don't know if it's the collected works of Schelling or not, but there's a fairly extensive collection, and it shows that Voegelin read it with a great deal of care. He has penciled remarks on the margins. There are little slips of paper in the books and so on. So I don't think there's any doubt that historically Voegelin was influenced by Schelling. The great problem always is that Voegelin pretty much made use of his sources. So he wasn't so much, and if you can see that in Order and History in volumes 2 and 3 pretty easily, that it's not really an exegesis of Plato or Aristotle or Thucydides. It's what can I, Eric Voegelin, take from Thucydides and Plato and Aristotle, and in this case Schelling, in order to, as he would say, make sense of reality. So that all of these sources, quote sources, are in fact kind of raw material for Voegelin's own thought. So you can find an exegesis of Schelling, and Day does this, but I don't think it's really. He's not a Schelling scholar. He's somebody who uses Schelling, just like he's not a Baudin scholar. He's somebody who uses Baudin for his own purposes. And of course, this doesn't always endear him to the Schelling scholars and the Baudin scholars of the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Very interesting. Richard Desjardins is next.
Thank you, Mr. Stoner. Professor Cooper, I'm glad to meet you. Finally, I've seen your name in the book. I have it here. I've read it a while ago, so thank you very much for writing that book. Recently, I read a paper, I think it was published back in 2018 by Professor Madeleine Poirier, in which he questions Voegelin's, how shall I say it, his sympathetic view of Christianity, or even whether he believes in the existence of God. And which came as a shock to me, because while I don't understand, all that much about Voegelin, that was something I was pretty sure about. And I'm wondering, where do you come down on this? Is there something there, or is that something we should just reject out of hand?
Yeah, I know that this is a source of some controversy, particularly among Catholics more than Protestants, and I did try and make sense of it in the last thing I wrote on Voegelin's philosophy of consciousness, And basically it's that he is not a creedal kind of thinker. He's if you wanted to call him a Christian philosopher, it's the noun is philosopher, and the adjective, it's just a kind of philosopher. But I think he was first of all a philosopher rather than some kind of believer. But again, that's just my interpretation. I'm not entirely sure. I remember reading Maven's paper, but I didn't really engage with it. I just thought, oh well. There was a guy named Wilhelmsen who wrote a review of volume 4, and he was particularly offended by the chapter on Paul's vision of the resurrected. And it was pretty clear, at least it was clear to me, I don't know whether it was clear to him or not, that it was a very dogmatic reading of the Gospels and the New Testament, that Voegelin would have rejected simply on methodological grounds, that you don't understand the gospel if you think of it in terms of doctrine. And I mean, there's that paper that he wrote, The Gospel and Culture, that if you read it, I would say without any dogmatic presuppositions, and you're a Christian, you would find nothing objectionable. There's a nihil obstat on that particular paper. And what he was doing in volume 4 that so annoyed Wilhelmsen, I think, really wasn't about an exposition of Christianity. It was about, as he says, Paul's vision, which is in Vogelin's language, a spiritual vision of the resurrection. It's not a dogmatic belief that God ascended, or Jesus ascended into heaven, became the Christ, and sat on the right hand of God the Father. The stuff that you might repeat in church. That's not what he was up to, I don't think.
We have a question from the Vogelin room, and the grad students gathered there. So go ahead and.
Hi, Dr. Cooper. Matthew Flanders here with the History Department at LSU. One of the things that I was struck with as you were speaking was Vogelin's almost polyglottic status. He knows Latin, he knows Greek, he knows German and English. So that's kind of amazing. But then what I found interesting as I was reading the text was, you wouldn't think that he would easily lose a language. And he talks about how he learned Russian while his year in Paris, and then he lost it. So because he just didn't return to it. So my question is, does that betray a little bit about what he thinks about whether or not you can consider Russians and Russian thought part of the classical Christian tradition that he so fights for? Is his loss of Russian maybe an indication that he doesn't consider that relevant to his overall project?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, well, I know that when you get older, you'll forget stuff that you know now, including languages. I mean, it happens. Even if your French or German is very good, if you're not in France or Germany for a while, it'll take you a couple of weeks to remember how to speak those languages. But your general question is a very good one. Peter Emberley, who he and I did the translation of the Strauss-Vogelin correspondence. He was very interested in the Russian Orthodox thinking. I forget he had a very technical language about discussing all of this. And he said that Voegelin never really dealt with what is apophatic, I think, symbolization. He said he never dealt with that, and I expect that's true. It's certainly true, as he said, that in the autobiographical reflections, that that he learned his Russian in Paris so he could speak to these Russian exiles. One of the most famous Russian exiles I don't think he ever met, which was Alexander Kozev or Kozhevnikov. That would have been a very interesting meeting. I mean, he read Kozhev's work later, I know that. But you know, this just happens. Nobody knows everything. And if you don't have any reason to keep up your Russian, then you don't, and it just, you know, it atrophies. What I have always found just really quite astonishing is he clearly had a gift for languages. When he was in Munich, he recovered some of his Chinese, he said, so that he could check the translations of two of his students there, one of whom was Opitz, to check their translations of the classical Chinese texts. And if you've ever looked at what classical Chinese looks like, it is a lot more complex than modern Chinese. So even as a mature human being, he was in his, you know, well into his 60s. He could still, you know, muster up whatever it takes to learn a very complex language like classical Chinese. I find that just astonishing.
Barry, with the queue being open, I have another question I thought of that's come up a few times, and that has to do with the centrality or maybe non-centrality of Plato and Aristotle to his work. I mean, you mentioned that Greek is something he learns later. He realizes he has to know his Greek. I mean, he learns in America of all places. And then are Plato and Aristotle central to him, despite the fact that he begins with Israel in Revelation, that he begins with Mesopotamia and so forth? Is it still true for Voegelin that these are the fundamental texts of Western political thinking, or maybe political thinking generally? Would he have ever said that, or is it just that this is what struck him and what he had to know? And I guess that's come up several times as we've talked about his intellectual biography. To what extent is Voegelin someone who just took an interest in a lot of different things and sort of moved from one thing to another and so forth? Or does he really, do his works lay out a kind of curriculum for study for those of us whose inclinations might be in different ways?
That's a very interesting and complex question. My response would be something like this: that Plato and Aristotle provide the foundations for what we now call philosophical anthropology, and that as a term and as a discipline is an early 20th century invention, I guess. And when I said that initially Voegelin relied on Schelling, it's because he hadn't yet seen that Schelling was relying on Plato and Aristotle. That would be my interpretation of that. So then he did. Then he went back to the source of the what he would call the noetic symbols of what it means to be a human being. They were not. I mean, all of the language that he uses about the search, you know, the zetesis and all of this stuff, is just lifted straight from mostly from Plato, but also from Aristotle. And I think he does this because it is a way that expresses what he is experiencing, what he's going through in this kind of endless search. I mean, remember the title of the last volume of Order and History, In Search of Order, right? It's the search that keeps, I would say, that keeps him going from all of this early material when he was like the Mongols, like the Mongols' orders of submission. It's a fascinating, fascinating piece of comparative jurisprudence. But normally political scientists don't think about that. But he did. He got interested in it, and he followed it, and he read everything that was written about the Mongols, in the languages that he had access to. And what unifies it, I think, and again, this is, I may be wrong, is the search for an adequate way of expressing his experiences of reality, and preeminently political reality, but not just politics.
We have two more questions, and let's finish with those. We have one more from the Voegelin room. So go ahead with that.
Dr. Cooper, my name is Thomas Cloud, and I'm very interested in Voegelin's immersion into different consciousness that versus someone like Oakeshott. Oakeshott has several comments about how he's interested in China, but he never thinks he can understand China. To what extent has Voegelin been regarded, perhaps by Chinese scholars or any other scholars, as an accurate guide to that consciousness, that way of being in the world? Has he ever been? Anyway, that's the question. Has he ever been evaluated in that respect?
You mean by Chinese scholars?
Any scholar that would perhaps be outside of our normal experience, right? So we're in the U.S. and Canada and Europe.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Well, I know that some of his books have been translated into Chinese. The New Science, for example, is available in Chinese now. I'm not sure that the Chinese Communist Party knows that, because it's not, it would not be compatible, I think, with what they tend to espouse. There have been Chinese students of his work that have written papers in English explaining how he was so important for their way of resisting the ideological uniformity of the PRC. But I remember years ago, this sounds really bizarre, but before Xi Jinping took over, the Chinese were looking towards federalism as a way of assisting in modernization, and they sent a delegation of people to Canada. I'm sure they went to the States as well, and I was invited to give some lectures in China, and I did. This was I would say in the early 80s, and I was surprised that Chinese scholars, particularly younger ones, were not very familiar with Voegelin, but they certainly were familiar with Oakeshott and with Hannah Arendt, which I found really very interesting. And they were interested in Arendt in the context of Judaism, at which normally we don't think of. Everybody knows that she was Jewish, but she's not really considered a Jewish thinker. But the way these Chinese guys, they were younger scholars, they saw her as a Jewish thinker, and I just found that really quite amazing. So I guess the bottom line here is that you'll always find some very strange surprises when you go from what we're familiar with and the way that we, so to speak, categorize the great political thinkers of the 20th century, that of which I think that Voegelin, Arendt, and Strauss and Oakeshott are preeminent. When we go into a completely different cultural context, the way that these thinkers are received, I would say, is always going to be a surprise.
Let's go for our last question to Alejandro Medina. You can unmute yourself, please.
There we go. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. This is fascinating, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the series. I wanted to ask Dr. Cooper what you've said about these, how do you say it, the consciousness, the different kind of consciousness that Voegelin had to develop in order, or the philosophy of consciousness that he had to develop in order, especially compared to Husserl, in order to deal with history, philosophy of history. I was interested in that. Perhaps it's too late a time now to start on that question, which would be a very big question, I suppose. But from what you're saying and what I hear, I'm just immersing myself in Voegelin here in a little corner of Spain, between Spain and Portugal. What I'm hearing is, it makes me think that Voegelin is more of a philosopher, period, who happens to be dedicated to a particular aspect of the human experience, in this case, politics and history, rather than a political historian as such, or a political philosopher per se. And I wonder if you would agree with that he would be better categorized as a philosopher with capital P, or capital Phi, if you prefer. But above all, the difference, what a little bit about the history of consciousness, and if you could give perhaps a title by Voegelin on this issue itself, that would appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute observation, and it reflects what I would call his sort of endless search for the right way of expressing experiences of reality, of the whole of reality. And to go back to some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier on, he began basically as a lawyer, and then realized that law was tributary to politics, not the other way around, and that politics also included what he was initially called political ideas, and then political ideas, in fact, were related to experiences and symbolizations. So it's what we now would call the trajectory of his intellectual biography is, I would say, is one of ever expanding horizons. And that to say that he would call himself a philosopher, and he does in some of his later essays. And there was one point he says something like, yes, I am a philosopher who knows his business. So he was very much aware that many so-called philosophers are not particularly reflective, at least with respect to the importance of experience and consciousness and how you symbolize these various experiences. The consciousness problem is extremely complex, and it ends. And Voegelin is very, I think, quite clear about this. It ends in various kinds of paradoxes. If volume 5 is and the later what Voegelin scholars now call meditative essays are not simple, and they're not sort of logically developmental. They kind of curl back on themselves, and they modify, just like a Platonic dialogue. What Socrates says at the beginning gets modified as he goes through it, and so on. If you're looking for the Anglo-Saxon philosophical coherence, you're not going to find it, because the reality that he experiences gets clarified through the language that he uses, then that becomes a subject for further reflections and so on. Personally, I think that's what philosophy is, as a way of life, and I think that's also kind of what Voegelin means by philosophy, the way he uses the term in his later in his later writings. But, you know, lots of people disagree with that. So,
Well, and I can't imagine a better way to call time, even though we hardly have covered all of the issues. But thank you, Dr. Cooper, for that superb introduction to Eric Voegelin. We have, as I think I mentioned before, 4 other presentations the next 2 weeks. Then we take a break for a week. We have a presentation, take a break for a week, and then a presentation. Next week, Lee Trepanier of Stanford University will speak about Voegelin and his political thinking. And then we'll move to that question of consciousness, first with Carol Cooper the following week, and then most especially in the 4th session with David Walsh. So I hope you're able to join us a week from now. And in the subsequent weeks, I have in the chat the link to all of our future events, and you can find them on the Voegelin website. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Cooper, for getting us launched here in what I hope to be a very continuing, interesting discussion of Eric Voegelin's unique and very fertile thought.
thank you, Jim.